Imagine hundreds of men trying to cross a river immense, frozen while the Darling burns with anti-aircraft fire, the hills rumble with artillery, and every bank is transformed into a slaughterhouse. Some desperate German soldiers throw themselves into the water withdrawal, clinging to tables, corpses either simply swimming until their bodies give way to exhaustion or lead. Others, trapped in collapsed trenches, fire their last round. On the other side, thousands of Soviets cross under a hail of shells, dragging makeshift boats, crossing minefields, knowing that Stalin's order is clear. Not a single bullet. Step back. The price was devastating. More than 300,000 German soldiers died. Soviet casualties, although strategically successful, reached even more chilling figures. Villages were razed, rivers ran red, and fields were turned into makeshift cemeteries. The Battle of the Dnieper was a principle of the end for the Wehrmacht at the front eastern, but also was a testimony brutal of what a total war represents when fought without reservation. This is his story. Kursk, the fierce prelude to the Battle of the Dnieper. The dawn of July 5, 1943, began with a roar that shook the earth. In the Kursk region, a wheat plain southwest of Moscow, the largest tank battle in history unfolded. More than 2 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks and 4,000 aircraft clashed in a titanic clash that marked the turning point for the Third Reich on the Eastern Front. The German operation, dubbed Citadel, was conceived by Hitler as the masterstroke that would restore the initiative lost after the disaster at Stalingrad. The Kursk salient, a wedge-shaped protrusion of the front more than 150 kilometers deep, seemed a perfect target for an encircling maneuver. The idea was for Army Group Center, under Walter Model, to attack from the north, while Army Group South, under Hermann Hoth, to advance from the south. The objective was to close the pincers on the salient and destroy the Soviet forces contained within. But the plan had a fatal flaw. It had already been anticipated. For weeks, the Soviets had known about the attack thanks to an effective intelligence network and intercepted signals. Stalin, instead of attacking first, as some generals had wanted, opted for an unprecedented defensive tactic. He allowed the enemy to attack only to charge later, a decision that would set the future course of the war. Soviet preparation was extraordinary. 8 deep defense lines were built, 5,000 kilometers of trenches were dug, more than 500,000 mines were laid, and anti-tank batteries were camouflaged among the hills and crops. Red Army engineers created tank traps, crossfire corridors, and covert artillery ranges. Kursk was turned into a land fortress. The attack began with a German artillery barrage, followed by a massive advance of panzer divisions. In the early days, the Germans made limited advances of between 8 and 12 kilometers, but at a very high cost. The south was the most aggressive sector. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, including divisions such as the Leibstandarte, Das Reich and Totenkopf, clashed with elite Soviet forces near Prokhorovka on July 12th. There, on an open, sun-scorched plain, a battle was fought that still today seems like something out of a nightmare. More than 1,500 tanks clashed at close range in almost hand-to-hand combat. Dust raised by their engines, smoke from impacts, and fires generated almost zero visibility. The maneuverable and mass-produced Soviet T-34s proved as deadly as they were effective. In contrast, the German Panthers and Tigers, although better armored and armed, were vulnerable in numbers and mechanically unstable. The battle was chaotic. Tanks were burning everywhere, crews leaping through flames, gunners firing at close range. Within hours, the German offensive stalled. The plan to envelop the Soviets collapsed under fierce resistance, minefields, and the Red Army's numerical superiority. But the Battle of Kursk was not only a ground battle. In the air, a decisive war was also being waged. The Luftwaffe, though still formidable, no longer dominated the skies. Soviet Yakovlev and Lavochkin fighters, as well as Il-2 Sturmovik bombers, began to match and even outperform the Messerschmitts. German aviation, worn down by years of war, could no longer guarantee cover or continuous air support for its ground forces. And while the German lines were wearing thin at Kursk, another threat loomed in the west. On July 10th, Allied forces landed in Sicily. Faced with this new front, Hitler ordered transfers of troops, aircraft, and resources, further weakening the operation in the east. On July 13th, Hitler recognized the inevitable and ordered the cancellation of the offensive. Citadel had failed. The losses were catastrophic, more than 50,000 men and 300 tanks beyond recovery for Germany. The Wehrmacht no longer had strategic reserves capable of reversing the course of the war. In contrast, Stalin took advantage of the German retreat to launch his counter-offensive. It began with Operation Kutuzov, an assault against the Orel salient that pushed Model's forces westward. Shortly thereafter, Operation Rumyantsev attacked from the south, liberating Belgorod and Kharkiv in an unstoppable advance. For the first time, the Soviet offensive was sustained, planned, and efficient. The Red Army had learned, modernized, and no longer fought with desperation but with superiority. Kursk marked more than a tactical defeat. It was the definitive turning point. The Wehrmacht had lost the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. It could never again launch a major offensive. From then on, the war for Germany would be a constant retreat, a struggle to defend the indefensible, a succession of broken lines and lost cities. For the Soviets, Kursk was the victory they needed to consolidate their newfound power. It was proof that they could beat the Germans even in open terrain, even against their best divisions, even in their own game of mechanized warfare. It was a triumph of steel and planning over surprise and audacity, and they would not stop. The next objective was as monumental as it was symbolic: the Dnieper River, a natural wall that was to divide the Soviet advance, a defense line that Hitler promised would never be crossed, a stage where the fate of Ukraine would be played out, and perhaps that of the entire war in the east. The Dnieper-Carpathian offensive, the plan to break the heart of the Reich. After the historic victory at Kursk, the Soviet High Command wasted no time. It was time to launch a decisive offensive, an operation that would forever change the balance of power in Eastern Europe. The initiative was finally in Soviet hands, and Stalin demanded immediate results. The Soviets had to liberate Ukraine, drive the Germans back from the Dnieper, and take the war to the gates of the Reich. Thus was born one of the largest offensives of World War II, the Dnieper-Carpathian offensive. A colossal, unprecedented military plan that involved more than 2.6 million Soviet soldiers, 51,000 artillery pieces, 2,400 tanks, and 2,850 aircraft. It was a chain of coordinated military operations along nearly 1,400 kilometers of front, from Smolensk to the Sea of Azov, designed not only to cross the Dnieper River, but to destroy the German army group south, liberate Kiev, and advance toward the Balkans. The immediate objective was immense, as it involved forcing the crossing of the Dnieper, a river more than 500 meters wide, with high banks fortified by the enemy, and establishing multiple bridgeheads that would allow the massive entry of troops, tanks, and artillery. Soviet strategists knew it would not be simple. Unlike previous campaigns, which sought to encircle the enemy in pockets, this operation required a large-scale frontal thrust under constant fire, and with the enemy as an enemy. From Moscow, the Soviet High Command divided the front into several sectors. In the north, the 1st Belarusian Front would advance toward Gomel. In the center, the 1st, 2nd, and 4th Ukrainian fronts would concentrate their forces in occupied Ukraine, while the 3rd Ukrainian Front would deploy southward toward Krivoy Rog, Nikopol, and later Romania. This gigantic war machine, coordinated by commanders like Vatutin, Konev, Malinovsky, and Tolbukin, had to work like a precise cog. The Soviets knew the greatest challenge would be crossing the river. Therefore, they began massively stockpiling boats, pontoons, inflatable rafts, construction materials, and even trucks adapted to float. In some areas, entire units were trained to build bridges under fire. Factories in the Urals produced thousands of improvised landing craft. Troops received clear instructions. The crossing was to be carried out regardless of casualties. Meanwhile, Hitler was not blind to the danger. After Kursk, he understood that Stalin's next step would be the Dnieper. In response, he ordered the Wehrmacht to consolidate a firm defensive line on the west bank of the river. Thus was born the Panther-Wotan line, a chain of fortifications, trenches, bunkers, and anti-tank positions that was to halt the Soviet advance at all costs. But that line, for the most part, existed only on maps. German engineers and TOT units hastily began construction, but time was short and resources limited. Many positions were incomplete when the Soviet assaults began. Furthermore, the morale of the German troops was rock bottom. Since Stalingrad, a sense of defeat had settled in the lower ranks, and replacements lacked experience. Geography was also a challenge. The Dnieper was not a uniform obstacle. From its source in Russia to its mouth in the Black Sea, it varied in width, depth, and speed. In Ukraine, it flowed through key cities such as Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, and Kremenchuk. There, the banks were high and steep, giving the German defenders a tactical advantage. The Soviet forces, on the other hand, had to cross in precarious conditions, without cover, often at night, in makeshift boats. The offensive began on August 26, 1943. Along the front, the Soviet divisions began their advances, forcing the Germans to retreat in an orderly manner from the Kursk salient to the river. The Soviet tactic was clear: maintain constant pressure, attack in waves, and prevent the Wehrmacht from reorganizing. The advance was accompanied by a disinformation campaign. False radio signals, sabotage behind the lines, and targeted bombing diverted German attention. At the same time, the Soviet partisans, more than 100,000 organized guerrillas, disrupted railways, attacked convoys, and complicated the transfer of reinforcements toward the Dnieper. The German rearguard began to collapse from within. One of the first key cities was Poltava, a major German railway junction and logistics center. Its capture in late September allowed the Soviets to control part of the middle Dnieper line and prepare for the westward leap. But it wouldn't be easy. Every kilometer gained was paid for in blood. The Soviet strategy was ruthless. Stalin demanded speed, and his generals knew they could not be stopped. The Dnieper crossing would be accomplished with whatever was at hand. Thousands of soldiers took to the water in boats, rafts, floating gates, even inner tubes. Many died before reaching the other bank. But some made it. And once a small bridgehead was established, subsequent waves continued the attack. It was a war of attrition on an unimaginable scale. With each passing day, more sections of the river fell into Soviet hands. German fortifications, incomplete or poorly supplied, were overcome by brute force. Despite tremendous casualties, the Soviets pressed on. There was no turning back. For the Wehrmacht, it was the beginning of the collapse. Orders to hold came with threats. The generals knew that retreating without authorization meant summary execution. However, the pressure was so intense that even the most veteran units were beginning to falter. The Dnieper-Carpathian offensive wasn't just a military operation, it was an earthquake tearing apart the Eastern Front. Cities burned, bridges were blown apart, and the river was transformed into a gigantic liquid battlefield. The worst was yet to come. With multiple bridgeheads established, the Red Army would begin its next move, moving across the river not only infantry, but also heavy artillery, armor, engineers, supplies, and logistical vehicles, all under enemy fire, all on the march toward Kiev. The great battle for the heart of Ukraine had begun. The Panther-Wotan line, Hitler's last wall. As the Red Army gained ground with increasing ferocity, the Wehrmacht retreated toward the Dnieper, burdened by the remnants of decimated divisions, abandoned equipment, and morally broken soldiers following the defeat at Kursk. The only hope of stemming the tide of red lay in a still incomplete defensive line, a last bastion whose existence clung more to high command maps than to the reality of the terrain. This last strategic defensive wall bore the name the Panther-Wotan line. On August 11, 1943, Hitler ordered its construction. Its route extended from the Gulf of Finland to the Black Sea, following the course of the Dnieper River as a natural barrier. The logic was simple: to to take advantage of the defenses offered by the river and establish a fortified line on its western bank from which to contain the Soviets. But time was against them. The Soviets were advancing rapidly, and the terrain that was to be prepared for defense was still occupied by the Wehrmacht itself. Responsibility fell to engineers from the TOT organization, the Nazi Military Construction Corps. Defensive positions, staggered trenches, minefields, anti-tank ambush zones, bunkers and barbed wire networks were drawn up. But the execution was chaotic. In many areas there wasn't even a defined plan. The units that were to occupy the line arrived disorganized, with scarce resources, and had to fortify in precarious conditions. However, the problem was structural. The Wehrmacht was no longer the same as in 1941. The divisions were far below their nominal strength. The lack of effective replacements, ammunition shortages, the loss of supporting aircraft and the physical and psychological exhaustion of the troops undermined any possibility of a solid defense. Added to this was the fragmentation of the command. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal von Manstein, constantly clashed with Hitler, who, from his headquarters in Rastenburg, insisted on holding unrealizable positions. Hitler viewed the Panther-Wotan line as an impenetrable fortress, a sort of Berlin Wall 20 years ahead of its time, which must be held at all costs. He ordered that not a single inch of ground be conceded without his direct approval. This condemned many divisions to total destruction, caught between the order not to retreat and the impossibility of holding positions without means. Unlike the French Maginot Line, a defensive network built with years of planning, the Panther-Wotan line was improvised, reactive, without time or depth. In many sections, the line consisted of little more than ditches, a few machine gun nests and exhausted units digging with bayonets instead of shovels. The engineers barely managed to fortify a position before they had to abandon it in the face of the Soviet advance. In key sectors such as Zaporizhia, Nikopol and Dnipro, the line included more robust positions, taking advantage of abandoned factories, hills and urban features. But even there, the quality of deployment was uneven. The Luftwaffe, once queen of the skies, could barely provide aerial reconnaissance, and artillery was poorly distributed. The Dnieper's tributaries, such as the Desna and Pripyat, offered some natural support, but were easily breached with the volume of troops the Soviet Union was deploying. The German transportation system was also beginning to collapse. Trains were sabotaged by partisans, fuel depots were bombed by Soviet aircraft, and many units arrived at the front without their artillery or sufficient rations. In reports sent to Berlin, field commanders warned of paper fronts, positions that only existed on situation reports but were completely empty in reality. One of the most dramatic situations occurred in the Kremenchuk sector. There, German divisions awaited reinforcements and materials to fortify their lines, but were surprised by Soviet attacks before completing even a basic defensive line. The result was an immediate collapse. The Wehrmacht retreated across the railway bridge before blowing it up, leaving behind equipment and trapped soldiers. Politically, the line also became a symbol. Goebbels began referring to it in his speeches as the new wall that will stop Bolshevism, while propaganda bulletins spoke of impregnable positions. The reality at the front was the opposite. Soldiers arriving at their strongholds found open fields without cover, where desperate officers improvised defensive positions with ruins and felled trees. Replacement troops arrived without training. Young recruits from the Volkssturm, penal battalions formed by soldiers accused of indiscipline, and even elements of the SS Totenkopf and Das Reich, relocated after the carnage at Kursk, were deployed without cohesion, without radios, and with insufficient rations. Morale was at rock bottom. The slogan, "Resist until death," was interpreted as a sentence, not an act of heroism. The German High Command attempted to contain the situation by designating strategic points as Festungen, or strongholds, cities that must be defended at all costs. Among them were Dnipro, Zaporizhia, and Kiev. These cities were reinforced with heavy artillery and armored units, but not in the proportion that the scale of the Soviet attack required. as Red Army troops reached the eastern bank of the Dnieper and began to establish bridgeheads. The Panther-Wotan line was breached in multiple sectors. Its main weakness was that, rather than a defense in depth, it was a single, continuous, but fragile line. When a point was breached, there were insufficient reserves to seal it. In the nights following the first Soviet crossings, many German units without clear orders began to withdraw on their own, abandoning positions without authorization. This led to confusion and reprisals. SS officers executed soldiers accused of cowardice, while some commanders were relieved for questioning Berlin's decisions. The Panther-Wotan line, conceived as the last wall of German defense, became a death trap for its own soldiers. It was a brittle, symbolic line, more useful for propaganda than for strategy. While Hitler spoke of heroic resistance, German soldiers began to drown in the Dnieper or be crushed by the T-34s that repeatedly crossed the river. Collapse was imminent, and on the other side of the river, millions of Soviet men were preparing for the final assault. The river assault, bloody crossings, and the fall of Poltava. In the early hours of September 22, 1943, the sky over the Dnieper lit up with the fire of thousands of Soviet cannons. Stretching hundreds of kilometers from Smolensk to the Sea of Azov, Red Army troops launched the most ambitious and brutal assault yet conceived, to cross the wide and treacherous Dnieper, break the Panther-Wotan line, and liberate Ukraine. The immediate objective was clear: they were to establish bridgeheads, consolidate positions, and launch a general offensive that would break the backbone of Army Group South. The river, more than half a kilometer wide in many stretches and with treacherous currents, presented a formidable natural obstacle. But the Soviets, determined to maintain the initiative behind Kursk, had secretly amassed millions of men, pontoons, rubber dinghies, improvised rafts, and even doors and planks stolen from abandoned houses. Anything that floated would be used. Stalin had ordered, "The Dnieper must be crossed at any cost." The forward units began the crossing without waiting for heavy support. In many sectors, they didn't wait for artillery to get into position. They crossed in the dark, in chest-deep water, under the howl of German MG-42 machine guns. Some soldiers used their backpacks as floats, others tied logs together to cross in groups, most simply relied on swimming. The crossing was a bloodbath. German troops, well positioned on the western hills, opened fire with artillery, snipers, grenade launchers, and mortars. The pontoons were hit before reaching the far bank. Boats full of men were incinerated in the water. The currents ran red and carried corpses downriver. In the first 48 hours, Soviet losses were so high that some divisions were reduced to half their strength before even reaching dry land. However, some units managed to establish small footholds on the west bank. These were precarious positions held by exhausted companies without cover and with supplies cut off. But they were sufficient. Around them, Soviet engineers began to dig trenches, lay telephone cables, and build makeshift ramps for the landing of reinforcements. Parallel to the Dnieper crossing, Soviet forces launched attacks westward to take control of key logistical points. One of these was Poltava, a former Cossack city converted by the Germans into a vital garrison for rail control of central Ukraine. There, the Germans had installed ammunition and fuel depots, command centers, and rail links connecting to Dnipro and Kharkiv. Its capture was essential to cut off the enemy's logistical flow. The offensive on Poltava was led by the Steppe Front under General Ivan Konev. After liberating Kharkiv in August, his troops marched southwest in a lightning advance. The Germans, exhausted and retreating, barely managed to organize a token defense. The panzer divisions assigned to the area had been diverted toward the Dnieper, and the Poltava garrison numbered fewer than 7,000 men, mostly rearguard units, stationary artillery, and administrative officers. The attack began on September 21st. For 2 days, Soviet troops surrounded the city, cut the railway lines, and bombed evacuation routes. The Luftwaffe attempted to intervene but was repelled by growing Soviet air superiority. At dawn on the 23rd, the troops entered Poltava. The battle was brief but bloody. The fighting raged house to house. The German soldiers, with no hope of escape, offered resistance on the cobblestone streets, supported by machine gun nests installed in public buildings. The fighting lasted less than 24 hours. By September 24th, Poltava was in Soviet hands. The loot was immense. Ammunition dumps, captured locomotives, fuel barrels, radio equipment, operational maps, and classified documentation. But the most important was control of the railway crossing, which allowed the Soviets to transport entire units toward the Dnieper front, without relying exclusively on the road network, still clogged by the autumn mud. With Poltava secured, Soviet forces reinforced their presence in the central Dnieper region. More than 20 bridgeheads were established in various sectors. Some were mere pockets of resistance, held by unsupported infantry companies. Others, such as Veliki Bukrin and Liutezh, became massive penetration points, where sappers built bridges under constant German artillery fire. The German response was fierce but limited. The available divisions were exhausted. Reserves were running low. Counterattacks launched from the Panther-Wotan line were thwarted by Soviet artillery already deployed across the river. T-34s, transported by raft, began landing on the most consolidated bridgeheads. It was the beginning of the end. On a political level, the situation began to generate panic. In Berlin, Hitler spoke of necessary sacrifices and ordered that every Soviet crossing be destroyed, regardless of the cost. Manstein, for his part, pleaded for freedom of maneuver to withdraw units before they were completely destroyed. But High Command orders remained anchored in a defensive logic out of touch with reality. By mid-October, the Red Army had already moved hundreds of thousands of men across the river. Trains, trucks, and heavy artillery columns began to circulate across the field bridges. Soviet superiority in men and resources became overwhelming. In many sectors, the German line began to collapse even before the final assault. The fall of Poltava and the establishment of multiple bridgeheads marked a turning point. This was no longer a limited offensive. It was an all-out campaign to wrest Ukraine from the Wehrmacht and push it westward. And on the horizon, amid the river mists and the smoke of the fires, the next major objective began to appear: Kiev. But before that, the skies of the Dnieper would burn. The sky on fire, the air offensive and the massacre of Soviet paratroopers. As the Red Army consolidated its positions along the Dnieper, the skies over Ukraine became a new battlefront. Soviet air forces and the Luftwaffe clashed in an air campaign that would determine the fate of the offensive. The riverbanks, already bloodied by crossings and ground combat, were now filled with the roar of engines, aerial bombing, and the high-pitched drone of circling fighters. In this brutal context, Stalin and the Stavka ordered a daring and desperate operation: the mass dropping of Soviet paratroopers behind German lines. Since late September, the Soviets had intensified their air activity over the Dnieper. The Red Army Air Force deployed more than 2,800 aircraft to the region, including medium bombers, Yak-9 and Lay-5 fighters, as well as the dreaded Il-2 Sturmovik, specialized in ground attacks. Their objective was twofold: to support the ground advance and neutralize the Luftwaffe's response capability. The Soviet pontoon bridges and bridgeheads were extremely vulnerable. A single airstrike could destroy days of work and prevent entire units from crossing. Therefore, air defense became a priority. Anti-aircraft batteries were placed on the hills. Soviet fighters constantly patrolled the area, and improvised airstrips were built to sustain continuous operations. The Luftwaffe, although still lethal, faced increasing limitations. After the Kursk disaster and attrition on multiple fronts, its units operated with limited resources. Heinkel and Junkers bombers barely reached their targets before being intercepted. Many veteran pilots had been killed, and replacements lacked adequate training. Even so, they managed to inflict significant damage in the first days of October. Several Soviet transport columns were targeted with precision. Several improvised bridges were destroyed. In sectors such as Zaporizhia and Kremenchuk, German airwaves managed to delay the passage of armored vehicles for days. Airborne tensions reached their peak with the Dnieper airborne operation, one of the Red Army's riskiest and most tragic actions. The Stavka had ordered the infiltration of Soviet airborne forces behind German lines to cut supply routes, seize key heights, and facilitate the advance from the bridgeheads. In theory, it would be a masterstroke, destabilizing the German defense from within, as the Germans had done in Crete in 1941. On September 24, 1943, the launching began. More than 4,500 paratroopers from the 3rd Guards Airborne Brigade and associated units were transported in Lisanov Li-2 aircraft, Soviet copies of the Douglas DC-3, in a chaotic night operation. The plan required precision, but it was executed with a mixture of urgency and disorganization. Errors began before takeoff. Many pilots lacked up-to-date maps. The ground-based location markers, which were supposed to guide the drops, were not installed. The weather conditions were adverse. And to top it all off, German anti-aircraft fire was far more intense than expected. As they approached the drop zone, the Soviet planes were hit by ground-based shells. Some caught fire before dropping their men. Others, lost in the night, dropped the paratroopers in German-held sectors. The result was a disaster. Thousands of soldiers landed far from the objective. Some fell into German trenches, others into forests or swamps. Several were shot down in the air by enemy fire. Many aircraft returned to their bases without having carried out the drop. The chaos was total. There was no concentration of forces or coordination. The supposed offensive operation became a series of isolated engagements, with small surrounded units fighting without contact with command. Despite the chaos, the Soviet paratroopers demonstrated extraordinary courage. In small groups, they held out for days in forests, rural roads, and abandoned villages. They harassed supply routes, ambushed convoys, and kept numerous German units engaged in counterinsurgency tasks. In some areas, they joined local partisans and formed small guerrilla groups that persisted for weeks behind enemy lines. But the operation had failed. More than 70% of the men dropped were killed or captured. The strategic impact was minimal. What was supposed to be a lightning operation became a tragic symbol of the price paid for improvisation. The Stavka would never launch a paratroop operation of that scale again for the remainder of the war. The Luftwaffe, for its part, seized the opportunity to severely punish the drop zones. Patrols of Focke-Wulf fighters and Stuka bombers were sent to mop up the rear. Mass executions of surrendering paratroopers were reported, especially in the Kiev sector. The SS, in charge of internal security, showed no quarter. At the same time, the fighting in the skies continued unabated. The number of Soviet missions increased daily. To maintain air control, the Red Army introduced a new tactic: massive, coordinated low-altitude fighter and bomber attacks. Il-2s, known as flying tanks, skimmed the treetops, dropping rockets and bombs on German positions, trains, anti-aircraft batteries, and retreating columns. In the bridgehead areas, Soviet air cover became almost absolute. Divisions crossing the Dnieper did so with constant support from fighters and light bombers. Dedicated air corridors were established for transport and medical evacuation. Planes even dropped supplies directly onto engineers building bridges under fire. It was a vertical front. By mid-October, Soviet air supremacy was a fait accompli. The Luftwaffe could barely operate effectively during the day. German fighters were outnumbered, and their losses could not be replaced. Ground units, isolated and without air cover, were beginning to crumble. The Dnieper front was slowly opening, under pressure from both the sky and the ground. The skies of Ukraine were burning, but the earth was beginning to shake with the sound of something else. Soviet armored vehicles were already across the river. The columns were organizing, the routes were clear, and the cry that ran through the Red Army trenches began to spread like a wave. "We are advancing toward Kiev." Crossing hell. The bridgeheads the Soviets built under German fire. After the initial bloody crossings of the Dnieper, the Red Army did not stop. On the contrary, It intensified its efforts to turn the small positions gained across the river into powerful operational centers from which to launch the next offensive phase. These bridgeheads, many of them mere strips of ground won in blood, would be expanded and fortified under constant fire in a desperate race to prevent a German counteroffensive. Every meter gained was defended with nails, bayonets, bodies, and mud. The main points chosen by the Stavka to establish these bridgeheads were Bukrin, Liutezh, Veliki Bukrin, Khortytsia, and Dnipro. In each of these sectors, Soviet sappers worked day and night. Often with no tools other than shovels, their bare hands, or dynamite, they built trenches, dug tunnels, emplaced cannons, and marked access routes. Some soldiers became engineers overnight. The mandate was clear. Everything must be functional, everything must hold up. However, troop transport was an odyssey. With railway bridges destroyed and watercraft still limited, the crossing was made via pontoons, wooden barges, inflatable rafts, and even barely buoyant amphibious trucks. Some engineers improvised ferries with barn doors nailed over sealed drums. The crossing was made at night under bombardment in the dark, with the constant fear that a German flare would illuminate the path and activate the anti-aircraft batteries on the western hills. Thousands of soldiers crossed without heavy weapons, just rifles, grenades, rudimentary first aid kits, and bayonets. The rest would come later. For days, the companies that managed to get through fought without artillery support, without direct air cover, without reinforcements in sight, but they held on. Every day they survived, more troops crossed. Every night, more columns arrived with equipment, explosives, and radios. The real challenge was transporting supplies. Without solid bridges, the Soviets devised floating routes camouflaged by the morning fog and campfire smoke. Often, the trucks had to advance in the shadows, in rows, with their lights off, and under the constant wailing of German artillery. Each crossing was Russian roulette. One hit was enough to blow an entire column to pieces. The sappers worked with surgical precision. In a matter of hours, they could assemble a 200-meter pontoon bridge, floating, reinforced with steel planks and chains. But these bridges were short-lived. Every day they were bombed. Every night they had to be repaired. The construction of smoke bridges, a technique that used fog generators to conceal enemy activity, became essential. Under these chemical clouds, invisible to German artillery, Soviet trucks and tanks crossed blindly, with only a few meters of visibility. The losses were atrocious. Many soldiers drowned before reaching the bridge. Others, trapped on pontoons, hit by mortars, burned alive among gasoline barrels and ammunition crates. Some boats were swept away by the current and ended up landing on the wrong bank, directly in front of German machine guns, but the Soviet machine guns were tireless. If a battalion was lost in the crossing, another would replace it at dawn. If a bridge was destroyed, it was rebuilt at night. The watchword was one: cross, hold, advance. In sectors like Liutezh, the bridgehead quickly transformed into a mass assembly zone. There, General Vatutin's Voronezh front established one of the main axes of advance toward Kiev. The sector was reinforced with anti-aircraft batteries, field workshops, makeshift hospitals, and underground supply routes. Even underwater telephone cables were laid, connecting troops across the Dnieper with the Soviet command east of the river. It was a monumental logistical feat. But the Wehrmacht was not passive. As bridgeheads were consolidated, the Germans launched concentrated attacks to eliminate them. The panzer divisions, still combat-capable, deployed in bloody counter-offensives, attacking the Soviet perimeters, attempting to break through the positions before they were irreversibly strengthened. In some cases, the bridgeheads were reduced to just a few kilometers in length, surrounded by the enemy on three fronts. The fighting was desperate. At Bukrin, Soviet troops established one of the most difficult bridgeheads to hold. Surrounded by hills dominated by German artillery, it became a constant hell. Divisions crossed under fire and were met with relentless bombardment. Even so, the advance toward Kiev was initially planned from there. More than 30,000 soldiers were dropped into that area in waves, in what would be one of the most costly operations in terms of lives of the entire Dnieper campaign. Transporting tanks was another feat. In the absence of railway bridges, T-34s were partially dismantled, crossed on rafts and reassembled on the opposite bank. Occasionally they were launched directly into the river with a skeleton crew, relying on their engines to propel them far enough. Many were sinking. Others arrived smoking, their cannons covered in mud but ready to advance. Field hospitals were stretched to their limits. Daily casualties exceeded thousands. Doctors without anesthesia operated on wounded soldiers in rain-soaked canvas tents. Transfusions were given in the open air amid explosions. Stretcher-bearers crossed the river again and again under fire, collecting bodies and bringing back weapons, radios, and ammunition. The river became a bleeding artery, a constant flow of life and death. Despite everything, Soviet morale remained high. Victory seemed inevitable. The units crossing knew they were marching toward a greater cause, liberating Ukraine, expelling the invaders, avenging Stalingrad. The echoes of Stalin's speeches, patriotic songs and family letters mingled with the roar of battle. Soldiers slept on ammunition crates, ate rain-soaked bread, and dreamed of advancing. In a matter of weeks, the bridgeheads ceased to be precarious positions. They became launching pads. Entire divisions were piled up on them, awaiting the final order. In their bowels, howitzers, trucks, Katyusha rocket launchers, and thousands of men armed to the teeth were piling up. It was the edge of the Soviet spear. The Dnieper had been crossed, and now, before them, stretched the road to the heart of Ukraine. Kiev, the martyr city, waited among ruins and trenches. What was coming was not a march, but a tide of fire. We advanced toward Kiev, the reconquest of Ukraine and the Czechoslovak Roar. The Soviet bridgeheads along the Dnieper were no longer points of resistance, but offensive catapults. From the most solid of all, Lyutezh, north of Kiev, General Nikolai Vatutin's Voronezh front was preparing to launch the final blow on the Ukrainian capital, still in the hands of the Wehrmacht. Preparations were massive. Dozens of divisions were concentrated. Hundreds of tanks were lined up, artillery stacked in all directions, engineering units, sappers, snipers, demolition crews, and most unexpectedly, a foreign unit ready to liberate Kiev alongside the Red Army, the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps. Since early October, planning for the capture of Kiev had begun to take shape. Initially, Stalin had pushed for an attack from the Bukrin bridgehead south of the city, but conditions there were impossible due to the swampy terrain, German control of the heights, and an overly exposed concentration of forces. After several failed attempts and extremely high casualties, Vatutin convinced the Stavka to reorient the offensive axis northward from Lyutezh, where the terrain allowed a more fluid advance, although it required greater flanking maneuvers. For weeks, a massive deception was carried out to keep the German high command distracted. While the real assault troops amassed at Lyutezh, the Soviet forces at Bukrin simulated a full offensive preparation, with visible columns, artificial smoke, fake radio transmissions, and falsified troop movements. Army Group South took the bait and reinforced the wrong sector. On November 1, 1943, the attack began. A storm of artillery preceded the advance of the Soviet divisions from Lyutezh, covering the forests, fields, and routes leading to Kiev. The offensive was led by the Soviet 38th and 60th Armies, supported by a wave of T-34 tanks, Katyusha rocket launchers, and, among them, soldiers of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps commanded by Ludvík Svoboda. This Czechoslovak Corps, formed on Soviet soil with exiles, liberated prisoners, and anti-Nazi volunteers, had been rigorously trained in the Urals. Their participation was political and symbolic. Stalin wanted to show that the war in the East was not just a Soviet crusade, but a liberation of the Slavic peoples. The Czechoslovak soldiers wore tricolour insignia, spoke a mixture of Russian and Czech, and advanced with pent-up rage over the occupation of their homeland since 1938. The offensive was devastating. Despite the mud, sporadic resistance from some German divisions, and the mine-strewn terrain, the Soviets advanced rapidly. The surprise was total. The Germans had expected the attack from the south, But now they saw tank columns emerging from the northern forests, enveloping their positions before they could regroup. The German defense was led by the 4th Panzer Division and remnants of the 42nd Army Corps, which had heavy artillery, some armored vehicles, and entrenched urban forces. But they were disorganized, poorly positioned, and, worst of all, lacked air support. The Luftwaffe could not operate in conditions of total inferiority, and the Soviet VVS dominated the skies with Le-5 fighters and light bombers that harassed supply routes and bombed withdrawal crossings. For 3 days, the fighting was concentrated on the outskirts of Kiev. The Soviet divisions maneuvered quickly, seizing roads, railroad junctions, and key positions such as the Petrivka Bridge and the Darnitsa station. Urban fighting began on November 4th. The city, occupied since 1941, was devastated, with entire neighborhoods in ruins, mines hidden in buildings, and booby traps left by retreating German sappers. The Soviets advanced house by house with snipers in windows, fighting in basements, and T-34 tanks knocking down entire walls to prevent ambushes. The 1st Czechoslovak Corps was deployed in the northeastern sector of the city, fighting in the industrial zone and in the Troishkina suburbs, where they staged a key assault on a fortified position at a power plant. There, after intense hand-to-hand fighting, Czechoslovak soldiers took control, raising their flag among the ruins. Meanwhile, the Germans began a hasty evacuation. The pressure was unbearable. The chain of command was broken. Crossfire turned every attempt at reorganization into a death trap. Reports spoke of German soldiers fleeing through the sewers, leaving heavy equipment behind, and others launching themselves into the Dnieper in makeshift boats to avoid capture. Some swam under fire, trying to reach the still German-held eastern bank, only to be shot down in the water. On November 6, 1943, after 48 hours of non-stop urban combat, Kiev was officially declared liberated. The Red Army took full control of the Ukrainian capital. Soviet casualties had been enormous, but the victory was unassailable. More than 50,000 German soldiers were killed or captured during the offensive. Thousands of artillery pieces and vehicles were abandoned. The Czechoslovak troops, in their first major combat action, had demonstrated their capability and courage, being celebrated in the Soviet press as blood brothers in the fight against fascism. The liberation of Kiev was a brutal blow to Hitler's prestige. In Berlin, the news was greeted with silence and fury. Goebbels cancelled all official celebrations and demanded reprisals. Hitler, isolated in his headquarters, denied the collapse. He ordered impossible counter-offensives, threatened replacements and executions, and began talking about turning Ukraine into a sea of ruins before allowing another retreat. But the reality was that the Eastern Front was dissolving before his eyes. In Moscow, the victory was celebrated with artillery salutes and church bells. Soviet propaganda showed images of tanks advancing on the Panther-Wotan bridge, soldiers embracing liberated civilians, and Czechoslovak comrades singing hymns in the rubble of the city. It was more than a military victory. It was a symbol of the return to the land that had been taken from them. In Kiev, martyred and heroic, the red flag was once again flying. But the Soviet generals knew that the advance could not be halted. Ukraine was not yet completely liberated. The Wehrmacht was still holding out in the Carpathians in Kryvyi Rog in the Dnipro region. The Panther-Wotan line had been breached, but the Reich still held its own. Even so, the echo of a cry resounded from every trench, every bridge crossed, every liberated street. We are advancing west. The capture and defense of Kiev, the resisted capital. On November 6, 1943, the red flag flew once again over the half-ruined buildings of Kiev. The Ukrainian capital, after more than 2 years under German occupation, was liberated in a lightning operation that combined tactical speed, strategic deception, and overwhelming firepower. But what seemed like an end to the Soviet offensive on the Dnieper quickly became a new beginning. German troops, still active in the surrounding area, launched a fierce counter-offensive that turned the defense of Kiev into a battle in itself. While Soviet soldiers celebrated alongside the few civilians still remaining in the city, the German High Command planned its revenge. Hitler, furious at the fall of such a symbolic city, ordered Field Marshal Erich von Manstein to counterattack with all available means. The objective was to retake Kiev before the Red Army could consolidate its position and turn it into an urban fortress. The Führer sent a lightning order. Kiev must return to our hands, or not one stone will be left standing. Manstein, a realist that he was, understood the difficulties. His troops were scattered, weakened by the steady retreat from the Dnieper, and supplies were scarce. Even so, he organized a shock group with the 48th and 4th Panzer Divisions, supported by armored grenadier units and artillery remnants of Army Group South. The maneuver was to attack from the west and south, encircle the city, and push the Soviets back toward the river. The offensive began on November 7th, just a day after the liberation. German armored vehicles advanced from Fastiv and Vasilkiv, outflanking the Soviet lines that were still being organized. The newly deployed Soviet units in Kiev, many still without ammunition or stable links to the rear, were taken by surprise. Some positions were quickly overcome, and in certain sectors southwest of the city, the Germans briefly re-entered the city. The fighting intensified. The streets once again became a battlefield. Soviet and German tanks battled among the remains of burned-out buildings. Infantry divisions exchanged fire from house to house, and snipers positioned in destroyed towers turned every move into a game of Russian roulette. The civilian population, caught in the storm, dug shelters in basements, rescued wounded with wheelbarrows, and hid their children under piles of rubble. The Germans made partial advances but could not sustain them. The Soviet 60th and 38th Armies, quickly reinforced by rail from the eastern bank of the Dnieper, began to counterattack. Soviet aircraft regained control of the air, accurately bombing the German columns attempting to approach. The access routes were dynamited by partisans and sabotage units. The German advance became slow, costly, and lacked real logistical support. In parallel, the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps played a vital role in defending the northeast of the city. Already battle-hardened, the Czechoslovaks dug in on the industrial approaches, using heavy machinery, metal structures, and ruined buildings to create impenetrable urban defense zones. In the Darnitsa district, they repelled at least 4 consecutive attacks, destroying a dozen armored vehicles and holding out under constant fire for 36 hours. The key to containing the counter-offensive was Soviet superiority in artillery and reserves. The Stavka, the Soviet High Command, had anticipated the German reaction. And while the Luftwaffe could barely offer aerial reconnaissance, the Red Army had complete tactical cover. Katyusha rocket launchers, 152mm guns, towed howitzers, and hundreds of pieces deployed around Kiev. Each attempted assault was met with a massive bombardment, breaking through enemy lines before they could consolidate. The November mud, caused by persistent rains, also played into the defenders' hands. German armored vehicles became trapped on rural roads and were easy targets for Soviet aircraft. Many tanks became bogged down in ditches deliberately dug by sappers, while mines and ambushes in the nearby forests further reduced German offensive capability. By November 15th, Manstein realized that the objective was unattainable. Kiev was firmly in Soviet hands. The German retreat was chaotic. Under constant fire, with fragmented columns and no air cover, the troops retreated toward Zhytomyr, leaving behind hundreds of destroyed vehicles, abandoned positions, and thousands of corpses. Some units attempted to destroy infrastructure before leaving, but many were intercepted or defeated along the way. The defense of Kiev thus became a symbol of the Red Army's ability not only to attack, but also to sustain its conquests. What had begun as a lightning operation ended up becoming a decisive turning point in the Ukrainian campaign. Control of Kiev allowed the Red Army to secure a vital railway junction, reorganize its fronts, and prepare new offensives westward, toward Zhytomyr, Vinnytsia, and beyond. The city, however, was devastated. More than 60% of the buildings had been destroyed. Universities, factories, bridges, and stations were reduced to rubble. Tens of thousands of civilians had died since the occupation in 1941. The liberation was not a full-blown celebration, but a tragic respite after years of terror, hunger, and repression. Soviet soldiers walking through the ruins found symbols of the immediate past. Walls with Nazi slogans, mass graves of political prisoners, makeshift cells under cinemas and schools. The city bore deep scars, but also a will to rebuild. The first civilian brigades began removing debris as soon as the fighting ceased. The main streets were cleared. The metro returned to service weeks later, a symbol of the returning life. The capture and defense of Kiev sealed the failure of the Panther-Wotan line. Germany had lost effective control of central Ukraine. From then on, the German retreat would be steady and the Soviet advance overwhelming. The Battle of the Dnieper was not yet officially over, but the message was clear. The Wehrmacht no longer dictated the pace of the war. And as the last German columns retreated amidst smoke and defeat, a new cry echoed in the heart of Kiev. We are back, and we will never leave. The price of the Dnieper, the beginning of the end of the war. When the echoes of the last cannon shot died away on the banks of the Dnieper, what remained was barely a reflection of what had once been a German steel front. Amid the rubble of Kiev, the scorched fields of Cherkasy, the crater-filled swamps of Kremenchuk, and the burned-to-ash villages between Poltava and Dnipro, the final map was drawn of one of the most brutal, complex and bloody campaigns of the entire Second World War. The Battle of the Dnieper, an offensive comprised of multiple operations and counter-offensives involving more than 4 million soldiers, became the second largest campaign of the conflict, surpassed in scale only by the Battle of Stalingrad. But in many ways, the Dnieper was even more colossal. The number of simultaneous fronts, the geographical breadth, the number of troops mobilized, and the magnitude of the logistical effort involved were unprecedented. Between August and December 1943, the Red Army crossed one of Europe's widest and most strategic rivers under constant enemy fire. They did so not once, but at more than 20 simultaneous points, building floating bridges, throwing entire divisions onto improvised barges, and advancing meter by meter amid mines, mortars, and snipers. For many Soviet historians, it was the most symbolic operation since the defense of Moscow. For German generals, it was the beginning of the end. The numbers speak for themselves. The Wehrmacht is estimated to have lost between 300,000 and 350,000 men, including killed, wounded, prisoners, and missing. Many divisions were literally pulverized. Some units were absorbed by others dissolved in the chaos of the retreat without even leaving a record. For Germany, each of those men was irreplaceable. As the Reich wore down, it could no longer replenish troops as easily. Replacements arrived late, poorly trained, and poorly equipped. Soviet losses were even greater. Nearly 1 million casualties, including dead, wounded, and missing. The Red Army paid in blood for every advance. Some divisions crossed the river with 10,000 men and completed the operation with fewer than 2,000. The sacrifice was abysmal, but unlike the enemy, the Soviet Union had demographic depth, functioning industrial machinery, and a robust system of total mobilization. The sacrifice was not in vain. The Panther-Wotan line, conceived by Hitler as an insurmountable wall, was crossed, demolished, and turned into a series of ghost positions. Its failure was both symbolic and strategic. It demonstrated that the Wehrmacht no longer had the capacity to contain a large-scale offensive. The loss of Kiev, Poltava, Zaporizhia, Dnipro, and dozens of intermediate cities meant the collapse of the German logistical axis in Ukraine. Trains stopped arriving, depots were lost, and routes came under constant fire. Army Group South began a retreat that would not stop until Romania. At the operational level, the Battle of the Dnieper consolidated the Red Army's dominance over central and northern Ukraine. The door was open to the Carpathians, western Ukraine, Moldova, and even the Balkans. The German front became longer, more fragmented, and more unsustainable. The Reich's strategic reserves had to be divided between defending the east and containing the Allies in Italy, while the shadow of a future invasion of France loomed over the German High Command. But beyond the maps, names and dates, the Dnieper was a war of wills. The offensive demonstrated that the Red Army was no longer the improvised army of 1941. It was now a mechanized, hardened and disciplined force, capable of executing combined maneuvers, sustaining simultaneous operations in multiple sectors, and overcoming catastrophic losses without halting its offensive momentum. The soldiers who crossed the Dnieper knew that their mission was not merely military, it was moral, historical, and political. Soviet propaganda spoke of the reconquest of the homeland, the purge of the invader, and the liberation of the Slavic peoples. For many, Kiev was not just a capital, it was an open wound. The battle was fought not only with bullets, but with memory. In contrast, the Wehrmacht was entering a terminal phase of exhaustion. Its soldiers fought in increasingly precarious conditions, under contradictory orders, sabotaged by irrational strategic decisions, and without the real capacity to reverse the initiative. The myth of German efficiency began to crumble. They were no longer the conquerors of 1941. They were the survivors of an empire that was beginning to crumble. Politically, the Battle of the Dnieper also sent a clear message to the Western Allies. The Soviet Union was not only holding its own, but advancing. In Tehran, Stalin would eventually demand the opening of a second front with greater vehemence, arguing that the Eastern Front bore the brunt of the war against Germany. Churchill and Roosevelt took note. Planning for the Normandy landings began to accelerate. The victory on the Dnieper also reinforced Ukraine's role as the core of the conflict in the east. A fertile, industrialized land, strategic due to its roots and location, Ukraine became the linchpin of the struggle. Its recovery, albeit partial in 1943, marked the beginning of a campaign that would culminate in the total liberation of the country in 1944. Kiev, Poltava, Dnipro, Zhytomyr, Cherkasy, Kharkiv, all of them witnessed the collapse of the Nazi dream of domination in the East. For millions of Ukrainian civilians, the offensive was a mixture of liberation and trauma. The German retreat left cities in ruins, crops destroyed, mass graves uncovered, and mines planted along the roads. But it also meant the end of summary executions, labor camps, and systematic looting. The population emerged from their cellars, forests, and underground hiding places to greet the Soviet soldiers with tears, flowers, and promises of reconstruction. And for the soldiers who had crossed the Dnieper, every bridge built, every fallen comrade, every step westward was a reminder that the war was not yet over, that many battles remained. But something had changed. The Wehrmacht hadn't just been defeated on the ground. It had lost the initiative. The war was over. It was only a matter of time.